Allora inizia la conferenza stampa e quindi mi sposto direttamente per seguirla.
At Works
Parla Maria
account,
Zakharova.
we are providing interpretation into English, French and Spanish. Today we have a kind of a hybrid format. The questions will be asked by those present here in person and to those present with us online. I would like to add that we will not be able to cover all the questions, but all those who sent their questions in writing, we are going to respond to in writing after the press conference. Now over to Sergei Lavrov. Dear colleagues, good afternoon. Well, Happy New Year and Happy Old New Year. New Year is here for almost everyone, apart from our Eastern colleagues, some of them. So we will celebrate for one more month. I mean the Chinese New Year, the Eastern calendar New Year celebrations. So we got back to work from the very outset to the extended collegiate meeting of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense, and just recently his statement at the press conference on the 23rd of December. Well, a couple of words on the current situation. We see that the situation is not getting any better, and our Western colleagues are serving to exacerbate the current situation. They want to undermine the international relations architecture that is based on the UN Charter, and they are also following the course to replace the international order with the rules-based international order, and they want to thus create a new world. They are creating various formats in those areas of international relations that have long been on the agenda of the universal organizations such as the United Nations. They are trying to present themselves as those major workers that are doing their utmost to create the agenda for others, and those who do not join them are declared to be obsolete, and they name them revisionist, trying to review the situation and to change the situation, but actually this is the West that is revisionist in their attempts to amend the UN Charter. And we, together with the countries that are our strategic partners and friends, we are defending the UN Charter, its principles, its structure, its goals, and we are trying to protect it from any revisionism activities. The most odious project took place at the start of December, the so-called Summit for Democracy. The preparation for this meeting and the event itself and the results of this event announced by Washington prove that our colleagues in Washington want to re-ideologize our life, something that we got rid of just recently, but now they are trying to create new lines of division. The United States policies and NATO's policies that were declared as containment and deterrence of the Russian Federation and China, we see continuous attempts to artificially expand NATO, to drag such countries as Ukraine into it. We've recently heard very interesting statements coming from the NATO leaders, from the United States, that the Scandinavian countries that are not part of NATO will be welcome to join. So now they are trying to artificially tempt those countries to artificially expand NATO. And this alliance, after the Cold War, after the Treaty of Warsaw, has no purpose, but the attempts to artificially expand it are continuing. In December, as you are well aware, we have provided the NATO members and the US with draft documents, the draft treaty on security guarantees between Russia and the US, and the draft agreement on ensuring security between the Russian Federation and NATO countries. As we have highlighted several times, these documents come in package and seek to exclude any further eastward expansion of NATO and the deployment of threatening weapons systems close to our borders. On the 10th of January in Geneva, we had talks with our American counterparts, and on the 12th of January, there was a meeting with the participation of NATO countries and Russian delegation in Brussels. We have talked about the need to focus on the need to stop the expansion of one military bloc to the detriment of the interest of other countries in Europe. I guess that you have been following the very detailed coverage of these events and the interviews given by the representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense. I would like to reiterate that we need legally binding guarantees, as political commitments that were enshrined back in the 90s and any kind of oral promises have never been fulfilled by our Western partners, and they are not going to do that now. This is a topic worth discussion on its own. We have talked about the fact that such an approach is unacceptable, and we cannot approve of such very unilateral interpretation of security guarantees. So we expect a response from our colleagues in writing, just like we did, because we have submitted our proposals in writing, and we will continue working to be prepared for any kind of developments. We are convinced that if there is goodwill and if there is a will to compromise, one can always find mutually acceptable solutions. I can remind you that at the start of last year, we've managed to extend the New START treaty for 5 years with no preconditions, just like the Russian Federation proposed. We have commended this step by the Biden administration, as it was one of the first steps undertaken by the administration once this administration took power. The need for dialogue on all issues related to strategic stability, on all kinds of weapons affecting strategic stability. This is something that was discussed by President Putin and President Biden during the meeting in Geneva on the 16th of June 2021. They have also adopted a joint statement that reaffirms the principle that the nuclear war can never be won, so it can never be waged. And as part of the P5 at the Security Council, on the 30th of January at the high level, the statement on the unacceptability of nuclear war and the obligations of nuclear powers to prevent nuclear war was adopted. And this step, undertaken by the P5 on the highest level, will help to prepare the P5 summit. This summit was initiated by President Putin, And now we are trying to come up with specific arrangements as to the timeline and the agenda of this event. We hope that this event will take place in person once the epidemiological situation would allow. We are definitely working on the Western front, but also in other areas of Russian foreign policy. Last year, we have been developing integrational cooperation as part of the EAEU. We have strengthened the integration as part of the Union State of Russia and Belarus. And all of that helped to promote President Putin's initiative on the formation of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. We've been developing relations in this context with our partners in Asia. First and foremost, we marked 20 years of the agreement on good neighborliness, a friendship with China. We've also been promoting the specially privileged strategic partnership with India and with the majority of our partners in the Asia-Pacific region, with African countries, with Latin American countries. As for the Asia-Pacific region, we've been focusing on the ties with ASEAN countries in the context of the formation of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. We've been fully tapping the potential for constructive dialogue that is provided by such integration organizations as G20, BRICS, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We've been engaged in resolving various conflicts, such as the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, the Iran nuclear deal, Palestine and Israel relations, the North Korea issue, and in other hotspots around the world. In this context, I would like to highlight the mission that has been accomplished and carried out by the CSTO peacekeeping forces. As per the request of the President of Kazakhstan, those forces helped to tackle the terrorist threat in Kazakhstan. And this threat came from beyond the country's borders. We've been providing diplomatic support to the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. As you are well aware, Sputnik V has been authorized for use in 71 countries, and we continue in our contacts with our international partners to explain the practical significance of President Putin's initiative that he presented at the G20 summit in October on mutual recognition of national vaccine certificates. We already have such agreements in place with a number of countries. In 2022, we will continue to work in all of the areas that I have mentioned. We will continue to defend the central role of the United Nations and the need for full respect of the international law as it is embodied in the universally negotiated and the universally adopted documents without any attempts to separate it into fragments and then to interpret those fragments for the benefit of one group of countries. We will continue to fight terrorism and cybercrime. We have relevant decisions in place that have been taken over the last year within the United Nations and in other formats. We will continue to support the Russian world, and we will support its unification as the multi-religious group and plurinational group. In October, the 7th Global Congress of Russian compatriots living abroad took place, and we have set out our plan of action for future. We will also monitor the issues related to the freedom of expression and equal access to information. In this regard, we will continue to insist that our Western colleagues would not ignore their commitments and would fully adhere to them. We will continue talking to each other, talking to you, the media, if you're interested in that. We are prepared for that. Thank you. Now we are moving on to questions. Ria Novosti, please. Can you hear me? Yes, yes, we can. Ria Novosti, Mr. Lavrov, you've already mentioned the outcomes of negotiations in Brussels and Geneva on our draft proposals. I would like to go back to this topic. Now we are expecting an answer in a written form to our draft proposals from the US next week and from NATO during this week. At the same time, we can see that our partners are sometimes critical and negative when it comes to the comments on very important provisions of those draft agreements. What actions would be undertaken by Russia if those draft proposals would be refused by the US and the NATO? That's my first question. My second question is, does Russia consider an expansion of its political and military and strategic presence in some countries? Thank you. As for the first part of your question, we, as you have said yourself, are awaiting a written response from our colleagues. We believe that our colleagues have understood the need to do this expeditiously and to answer us in writing. We will not wait forever, and the plans to drag their heels over this process are in place. We are aware that the prospects of reaching a consensus depends on the US. Whatever they say about the need to talk to their allies and the need to engage all the OSCE members in those processes, those are just hollow statements and attempts to drag out this process. When the relationships between the NATO and Russia were formed, when the foundation principles were outlined, when we reached the agreement to create the Russia-NATO Council, when in the context of all of those processes between NATO and Russia we have negotiated political agreements on code of conduct and on future behavior in the context of armed forces and weapon systems. No one talked about consultations with the OSCE or the EU. And by the way, the EU is now disappointed, as Josep Borrell put it, that they have been left behind. This is something we can discuss separately, but we want to see their response in writing, point by point, provision by provision, in both draft documents. We want to receive a response. This fits us, this doesn't fit us. If not, why? If we can amend it somehow, if we can change the language of the provisions, maybe you can add something, please provide it all in writing. You've mentioned something that's been hyped in the media recently, that the Western response is focused around the very resolute interpretation of the need to move away from the open doors principle of the NATO. But I would like to highlight once again that we are not linked by any agreements inside the NATO.
However, Russia, the EU, Americans, NATO members, neutral countries are very much interlinked by our political obligations under the OSCE. And in this context, OSCE provides us with, if you wish, a normative framework, exclusively because back in the 90s, an agreement was reached which was about the inadmissibility to undermine indivisible security, not to strengthen your security to the detriment of that of others. And in those legal documents, including in the European Security Charter, dated 1990, that was signed at the highest level, includes three components, and everyone put their signature under these components. Number one is something the West likes to evoke currently, the right to choose ways to ensure your security, including alliance treaties. The same document says, by the way, that each state has the right to remain neutral. We should remember that as well. The second block that comes after this, and this block is an integral part of this agreement, of this compromise, it says that each state shall respect rights of other states and will not strengthen their security to the detriment of that of others. Moreover, there is a special provision that under this agreement, under this declaration, this charter, no state or group of states or no organization can be more responsible for maintaining peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic, and they cannot consider any part of this region as their influence sphere. And our NATO colleagues and our American colleagues are actively using the first part of this package, and this package is a package deal, after all. They are actively using the part that says that each country can join alliances and try to ignore the other part. But they are interlinked, they are indivisible, and we are not bound by this norm that says that each state has the right to choose their allegiance if it is applied in crude violation of other parts of this interlinked package deal. This is something we have spoken about in great detail. We are currently awaiting a response in writing, and after that, if it's clear that it might make sense to resume negotiations, this issue that I have just explained, we will insist on receiving explanations regarding our partners' obligations that they undertook at the highest level. If our proposals are rejected, well, when it happens, or rather, if it happens, let me remain optimistic. If it happens, we will assess the situation, we will report to the President, and during his big press conference, he said that in such a case, we would make our decisions taking into account all factors, including our security interests. There is no way to predict the future, something that our Western colleagues are trying to do. I believe that it's counterproductive. What we need are concrete responses or other proposals. We want them to have to do with our proposals that we put out in our documents, and they are key proposals aimed at preventing a negative scenario in our shared region, and I mean Europe. And in this case, we will continue to watch the reaction of our colleagues, and we will try to understand how serious they are. Wendy Sherman, who was heading the American delegation in Geneva, later gave an interview, and she said that those were not negotiations. That was a meeting to study each other's positions. Well, that's very eloquent, because we came with our positions that were formulated in writing months before the Geneva meeting. Over these months, the US failed to study our proposal so as to formulate their own position. And instead, they chose to follow their oral explications. Well, this stage is long over. What was your second question? Opportunities? The speaker's mic is off. Well, we have multifaceted military and technical ties with our partners and our allies. We have our presence in various regions of the world, and it's something that has to do with our bilateral relations with various countries. And of course, we will proceed on the basis of global stability interests. When we discuss further steps with our allies bilaterally. And now we will give the floor to those journalists who are present online. Is Daily Telegraph here with us? Good afternoon. Daily Telegraph, Natalia Vasilyeva. As we know, the topic of Ukraine's not joining NATO and NATO's activities in Eastern Europe have been on the agenda for a long time, and Russia has raised these issues on many occasions. However, Russian officials call these issues urgent and demanding urgent action right now. Why has this issue become so pressing in December? What happened? It has just become too much. Well, it started in the 90s when those promises that had been given on NATO's non-expansion and non-deployment of their military infrastructure in the East, non-deployment of troops in the territories of new NATO members. Those promises were simply thrown away by NATO members. And there have been 5 waves of expansions, and as a result, NATO is here at our borders. When we were founding our relations with NATO, only Poland was an aspiring country, but the situation is vastly, dramatically different right now. Right now, all of these new NATO members are being actively used by the alliance, and our proposal is aimed at shrinking military confrontation and de-escalate the situation in Europe, but NATO is doing exactly the opposite. They are expanding the presence of their land troop and aviation in the territories adjacent to Ukraine. They conduct exercises in the Black Sea, and the number of such exercises have grown dramatically over the past few years, and many other things have happened. And it gives us ground to believe that this lofty rhetoric of the West, that if Russia does not comply with the West's demand regarding what it can do with its own troops in its own territory, which is absurd in itself, then, in the coming 2 or 3 months, the West would increase their activities of fast response and special operations troops around our borders. That is why, answering your question, I'd like to tell you that many things have changed, and foremost of them is the situation regarding the real configuration of arms and military equipment in Europe. I reiterate that it's inadmissible when they require us to send our troops stationed in our territory back to the barracks, when Americans, Canadians, and the English are almost permanently deployed. Well, they pretend that it is a rotation, but in fact they are permanently deployed in Baltic states and other North European states. When they create bases in the Black Sea, when they build bases in the Azov Sea, in Ukraine, and we cannot be happy with that. It's inadmissible. So the moment to start this only reflects the period when the West exploded. Let's not mince words. Let's be frank. In violation of all of their international obligations and counter to common sense, they chose to escalate the situation. Well, you see, the West condemns violent actions against civilians, they condemn human rights violations. But when bloody coup d'etats are made by those who swear their allegiance to the West embraces them. This was what happened around the Ukrainian coup. Many people died there, including at the hands of provocators. And this coup was, let me give you an understatement, it was approved by the United States, and Europeans followed suit. It is a known story, and no one is going to investigate the Maidan crimes. No one's going to investigate what happened in Odessa on the 2nd of May, when people were burned alive right in front of cameras. Right now, nothing's changing. These right sectors are the foundation for the new authorities. Poroshenko, Zelensky are all the same, and these organizations used to be considered as extremist in America, but right now it's different. It's quite similar to what happened in 2008 in Georgia, when Saakashvili gave his orders at a special mission of the EU that was trying to understand what happened. They officially reported that it was Saakashvili who started the war, but still, Georgia remains a friend of the United States, and friends are allowed to do whatever they want according to the West. Our patience has come to an end. Well, you probably know that, well, you're a Russian speaker, so you're probably aware of the proverb that we take a lot of time to prepare, but right now we are ready to set out on a journey. And we are waiting for the West to respond to our specific proposals. Let us continue with online. APC. Do we have ABC with us?
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Lavrov. Apologies, I'm speaking in English, but I know you understand. Thank you very much for holding the press conference and talking to us. America and NATO seem to have made it very clear that they're not going to give you the security guarantees that you've asked for, that Ukraine and other countries will not join NATO. Russia has admitted that the talks have failed to address the grievances. Now, assuming that this position doesn't change, it seems to me that whatever letters are exchanged aren't going to bridge that gap. If you don't get the guarantees you've said that you need, that there will be a military response. What does a military response actually mean? Could you lay that out? Are you ready to use military force to ensure that Ukraine never joins NATO? Not necessarily an invasion, you've ruled that out, but what does a military technical response actually mean? If I can also ask, just as a supplementary question, when Presidents Putin and Biden met in Geneva, there were assurances that President Putin would look into the case of Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed. Is that still the case? Is this still being looked at? Is there a possibility that the two men might, in fact, be released? Thank you very much.
Насчет ответа я не могу вам ничего добавить.
As for your question, I cannot add anything to what President Putin said after his press conference. When he was speaking to journalists, he was asked directly what can be the response if Russia's proposal on security guarantees is rejected. And he said exactly the following: this response can vary depending on the proposals that I, meaning President Putin, get from Russian military experts. Full stop. That's why I'm not going to do any tea leaf reading. That's something that Americans like to do. They always favor the use of the sanction stick whenever they don't like something. Moreover, I like it that for a few years, a position of a head of the Department for Sanctions exists under the Department of State. There is a separate division that is in charge of punishing everyone who somehow disagrees with the United States or sometimes doesn't do anything bad at all and is punished just in case. We believe that such matters should be settled on the basis of mutual respect and balance of interests. Russia's position that was presented by Americans to Americans and NATO is based on a balance of interests. These documents are intended to ensure security in Europe in general, in all European countries, including the Russian Federation. The position of the United States and its allies is about their wish to dominate in Europe. They want to create footholds, military footholds around Russia. They want to create irritants for us around our borders. And let me draw your attention once again to something that I started with. Do read the European Security Charter adopted in Istanbul in 1999. Everything that the West is currently saying or doing constitutes a crude violation of their obligations under this document. And I remember all too well. Let me give you another example. When we made such an attempt, let me get back to the previous question, why we were waiting for so long. We did not. Back in 2010, as far as I can remember, we proposed a draft agreement for the West, for our Western colleagues to consider. And we were misunderstood. We were told that was never going to be discussed. Back then, we quoted texts of documents, including the European Security Charter and other documents that state the need to respect the indivisibility of security principle. And we only said that we simply want to translate political obligations into legally binding form. The response was very informative. Dear friends, legally binding security guarantees can only be given to members of the North Atlantic Alliance. And this is the philosophy that undermines everything that has been done at the OSCE after the end of the Cold War, including the principle that I have just quoted, that no alliance in the Euro-Atlantic has the right to dictate its will to others. This is something Washington is doing, and I take it that it's enjoying that. We take no pleasure in this. However, we know how to ensure our own security in any case. Let me also assure you that we are not going to wait endlessly for any change, for any new promises. Let me be frank. We know that the West is expecting a scenario that will enable Americans to reject their responsibility for solving these issues at negotiations with us. First, they are going to dilute it in the Russia-NATO Council when they involve their allies, shall I say, to be polite. And at the OSCE, it's outright impossible to conduct any negotiations. If this organization would be prepared to negotiate, then it should become an organization first and foremost, and they do not even have a charter, so that the OSCE would be a legal entity in global affairs. For that end, we have been proposing for 15 years to start working on such a charter. The US, though, is saying that its flexibility, that is the main advantage of the OSCE. However, flexibility is not applicable to strict security guarantees.
we can see what is being done. We can see that they want to water it down in a kind of a nebulous discussion. So we will firmly await from the US, as we have mentioned to them, a response, a grown-up response. If you would allow me, I would like to go back to those present in person. I would like to give the floor to Finland, who are also part of Europe, but not part of NATO. The US radio in Finland. So something like that exists. Wow. Mr. Lavrov, you have already mentioned Scandinavia at the outset of this press conference. Does Russia respect the sovereignty of Finland and Sweden and our right to independently make decisions on security policy, including with regards to NATO accession? I would like to say that Russia fully respects the sovereignty of both Finland and Sweden. We believe that the neutrality of those countries is one of the main contributions into the global and European security architecture and ensures security and stability in Europe. But those who do not respect the sovereignty of Sweden and Finland are those who, by any means, want to provoke them to join NATO. And this question has been stirred for a long time. And at this stage, when we have submitted proposals to ensure the status quo of ante, many violations from the West is something that we have observed. And we can see that the public and the peoples in Sweden and Finland are not satisfied with it. So what is happening now is that Stockholm and Helsinki is urged to join NATO. They are saying that it's going to be quick and painful, so to say. They are promising to the Swedish and the Finnish people that, and this is something that we are discussing with our colleagues from Finland and Sweden during our negotiations. And we see that the leaders of Finland and Sweden are aware of all of the parameters and aspects of the situation, and we are sure that their contribution will remain resolute. Sputnik, please. Good afternoon, Sputnik Agency. Mr. Lavrov, on the 10th of January, the New York Times reported that the head of the EU diplomacy, Josep Borrell, has sent a letter to the heads of the EU policy that Europe needs to come up with its own security proposals, and he supported a direct dialogue with you personally. So, a few brief questions. Have you received his letter, and is Russia prepared to conduct a direct dialogue on security with the EU separate from NATO and the US? And how could you comment on the statement made by Josep Borrell over the last 2 days with regards to the outcomes of negotiations on security between Russia, the US and NATO? And do you believe that the EU is more ready to compromise than Russia and NATO when it comes to security? And what did Josep Borrell say about our negotiations this week? He said that he wants to have a separate direct dialogue with you on security. So this is why I asked this question. Maybe he sent you some kind of letter, perhaps a proposal to arrange a meeting, etc., etc., and when it can take place, if it is so. Well, as for the comments made by Josep Borrell with regards to security guarantees in the context of negotiations between Russia and the US and Russia and NATO, yes, we have indeed had the impression that the EU feels that it is left behind, and they urge for their contribution to be taken into account. They do not want to have any agreements in place that would circumvent the EU. I'm not sure how the EU sees its participation in those negotiations. And you said, and you mentioned that perhaps there is a possibility to have a direct channel of communication on security with the EU, separate from our security discussion channels with the US and NATO. Well, I can't say, and not because we do not want to have that. We actually regret that 7.5 years ago, the EU destroyed all the mechanisms, including those mechanisms that serve to discuss the practical issues related to security. And now that we have tried to negotiate with the US and NATO, and with NATO we have at least on paper the Russia-NATO Council and the underlying document in place, all the while, any channels of communication have been closed by our European colleagues. So this is a question that we should pose to Josep Borrell and other members of the EU. As for a possibility of a separate dialogue with the EU, independent from our dialogue with NATO and the US, well, I guess we should ask NATO and the US whether they would allow the EU to have an independent course in this regard. Because we want to have an independent European Union, we are closely monitoring the trends that we are currently observing within the EU. Those are quite controversial trends at times, and we see that the EU is concerned that their interests might be ignored, especially after Afghanistan, especially after what happened with AUKUS. We have seen that some of the EU members are sending signals that there is a need to form a strategic autonomy when it comes to resolving security matters. But at the same time, the EU has a very resolute lobby that counteracts any attempts to separate themselves from NATO when it comes to security issues, and they insist that NATO is a key to security in Europe. Those are the questions that need to be resolved in between those structures, and we are not greatly concerned by the fact who exactly is going to lead the negotiations, if those negotiations will be helmed by the United States anyway. It is on the United States that the security policy depends on. The security policy in Europe and in other parts of the globe where NATO is trying to establish its role regardless of the initial mission of this organization. And the United States have managed to go back to their leading, dominating role in Europe through NATO, and they are actively supporting the course related to any military issues between the EU and NATO. They have special agreements in place on military mobility. When the EU countries not part of NATO should provide their territory and their transport infrastructure for the movement of NATO forces. This is a very serious issue, and Sweden and Finland and Austria are sometimes taking part, and even quite often are taking part in military drills, and the legend at the origin of those military drills is not something innocent. We've talked with Josep Borrell the last time we met at the OSCE Ministerial in Stockholm on the 2nd of December. We did not have a specific meeting, but we did meet, and we have reaffirmed that we are not trying to avoid each other, but at the same time I can remind you that the ball is in the EU's court. We have not been trying to cut our ties. We have been talking to Josep Borrell just last year, and we are prepared to continue talking with him. But it all depends on to what extent he will be allowed to renew the dialogue with the Russian Federation and on how constructive would be the issues they are going to tackle. Khabar, Kazakhstan, please. Can you please turn on your mic? At the extraordinary video conference of the CSTO conference, the President said that the CSTO mechanism is now fully functional. Does the Kazakhstan conflict mean that the possibility of the usage of the collective forces of the CSTO becomes ever more real? And what was meant by the need to advance the procedure for the use of joint forces, and how the forces would be consolidated to fight the sleeper terrorist cells? I believe that the situation in Kazakhstan and the fact that the President of Kazakhstan has addressed and has requested the help of the CSTO member states showed that the efforts undertaken within the organization to create a peacekeeping potential, to create a peacekeeping contingent, were very relevant. As they say, if you want peace, prepare for war. Likely, we did not see a war, but the potential of those peacekeeping forces proved that they are capable of resolving issues to the global community. The West was astonished by the speed with which the events unfolded in Kazakhstan and the speed with which the forces from all the CSTO members were deployed in Kazakhstan. The West saw such rapid deployment for what it is, and I hope that we will not have any recurrences in future of using and deploying such forces. But if we would go back to the old Russian wisdom, we hope that nothing like that would be repeated again. We are doing everything in our power so as to prevent any such recurrences in future. But if anything should happen, we should be prepared, because attempts from the outside to dismantle the situation in Asia have been increasing, and those attempts are becoming ever more insistent and ever more risky, especially after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan together with other NATO members, and they left Afghanistan in the state that it is currently in when we need to restore the statehood of Afghanistan. Something else you asked? About the sleeper cells, sleeper terrorist cells. Well, it's all included in the mandate of the collective forces. It also includes fighting sleeper terrorist cells that should be carried out not by armed forces, but by special services, intelligence services. We have relevant structures in place under the aegis of the CSTO and under the aegis of the security councils of our countries. So now this issue would be taken even more seriously, and their work would be ever more relevant. Mir TV program, please. Mr. Lavrov, I represent the Mir TV company. Our office was destroyed in Almaty several days ago, and the protestants were not even stopped by the fact that Nursultan Nazarbayev helped create the Mir office, and the documents were signed by Nazarbayev and President Tokayev. Everything was destroyed, even the radiators. However, our colleagues continue to work, continue to broadcast live. We are being assaulted, but we remain resolute. So what was the point of destroying the office of this interstate TV company? Are you expecting any new sanctions from the West after the use of the CSTO forces? And why the West was silent when the militants were trying to destroy everything in Almaty and offices of TV companies as well? We have commented already on this situation. We have also sent the relevant information to the OSCE and especially the representative on the freedom of the media. It is indeed shameful for an organization that represents itself as a beacon of the freedom of the media has proved that they have double standards and they do not set the gold standard. What happened was truly unacceptable. They have destroyed the offices and they were a threat to the lives of journalists, and they have physically hurt journalists. And when the CSTO actually helped Kazakhstan to calm the situation, to help arrest those who were trying to organize this sabotage, those outrageous activities. At this stage, the West and the OSCE started to call for a ceasefire, to stop the violence. So the OSCE should do that if it should be turned into a true actual organization with its own charter. However, the Secretariat of the OSCE is not far from NATO Secretariat. During the Maidan demonstrations in 2014, the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Fogh Rasmussen, has publicly addressed President Yanukovych with a call not to use armed forces. And once the coup took place, Mr. Fogh Rasmussen actually changed his language, and he was calling on the putschists who came to power through unconstitutional means to use the force proportionally. And the person whom they considered to be a pro-Russian president, although this is not a correct interpretation and not a correct view of the situation, those who were not in close ties with the West were not allowed to use force. But if you are loyal to the West, then you can use force proportionally. So they should move away from the image that has been created over the several years. And the Secretariat of the OSCE, as we have stated multiple times to the chairmen and Secretary Generals of this organization, is truly discriminatory in its treatment of Russia and other countries of the CSTO. And this is something we are going to fight against. And this is when we need to use the OSCE. We need to make it a platform for equal dialogue based on the balance of interests and consensus. Although it is enshrined in the foundation documents of this organization, in practice we can see that the West is adhering to its course to privatize the Secretariat of the OSCE and all of its institutions. And this is something they need to deal with and not to try to sink our initiatives on security in this kind of amorphous organization.
I also have a question about the West's new sanctions after the CSTO used force. I cannot say anything on this topic because we do not deal with expectations and predictions, we deal with facts. However, our Western colleagues are capable of anything Let us consider an example. Right now, Washington is threatening to introduce new sanctions. The Congress has prepared some really tough sanctions. The White House is happy with some of them, isn't happy with others. Well, the mentality of those people who urge to prepare a sanction package in case a so-called attack against Ukraine by Russia, they are not alone. However, right now we hear that unless Russia withdraws its troops in its territory from the Ukrainian border, there will be sanctions against Russia without any attack. Well, anything could happen. However, we are ready for any scenario, and as for economic aspects, well, perhaps we used to have some illusions, but over the past 7 years, those illusions are gone. And at the Gaidar Forum, we consider this topic, and our famous economists, reputable liberal economists, are now very clear that we can only rely on ourselves. Those mechanisms of economic ties that depend on West-controlled structures are, of course, fraught with risks, and we are getting rid of those risks in a consistent manner, including first and foremost in high-tech. Let us get back to online questions. We have many questions. We have many journalists from Germany. Let us start with RD. I'm here with us. Good afternoon, German television. My question is going to be about Ukraine. If we take a look at the polls in Ukraine regarding joining NATO, even if it's not very realistic at the moment, we have an impression that the more pressure Ukraine is suffering from Russia, the more people in Ukraine say that they would like Ukraine to be a NATO member. How would you comment on this? I suppose that you see this situation in the same way. Well, apparently it's the continuation of the topic we have already covered today. Germany believes that Ukraine needs to be supported in it. When Ukraine wants something, we will do it. Don't you want to know what Russia wants? Is Russia less important for Europe than Ukraine? And you are dealing in alternatives. It's either pleasing Ukraine or something else. But we are following a different kind of logic. We want everyone to feel safe. We want everyone to feel needed. Just like the situation was like after the reunification of Germany, when they gave us the not an inch promise, meaning that they would not move military infrastructure of NATO to the east of the Oder. Well, we believed those promises and we wanted them to be delivered on. However, NATO chose to move further. And those promises came from presidents, from people who are supposed to be respectable. And we want Germany to remember our country's position when Germany wanted to reunite. Back in 2015, when I spoke in Munich at the International Security Conference and answering on a question related to Crimea, I mentioned, when I talked to my discussion partners, and I mentioned that we had to remember how our country supported Germans' desire to reunite, and Germans need to understand that Russians who live in Crimea, the majority of Crimea's population, also have the right to reunite with their own people, especially when there are militants, there are bandits who were sent against them with neo-Nazi slogans. Out from Crimea, they chanted. One of the parliamentarians from Bundestag laughed out loud, trying to present the situation as if these two issues were incompatible. I don't think they are, and I hope that Germany remembers Russia's position when your own Western allies were very much in doubt that Germany should be reunited. Well, life goes on. And speaking of Crimea and the Ukrainian authorities that you want to see in NATO, remember that from day one after the coup d'etat, when they did not care about Germany, France and Poland's signatures under agreements between Yanukovych and the opposition, and despite all assurances, despite all plans, they chose not to listen to what the EU was saying, and then the EU agreed. And those putschists then proceeded to state Russians in Crimea will never speak Ukrainian, think Ukrainian, will never glorify their heroes in the Second World War, and I mean the accomplices of Bandera and Shukevich. Then the Crimeans, decided to have a referendum after halting an attack from Ukraine. But when we discuss the topic of Ukraine and Donbass, when we explain it that it's Kiev that should respect Minsk agreements, previously we used to get responses that let us put this aside, let us just respect these documents. How can we do that if those who are supposed to respect those agreements are not doing that? And Russia's problems and Ukraine's problems with its own people, including with Crimea, started with this unconstitutional coup d'etat. And our Western colleagues used to say, oh no, it started with the annexion of Crimea. But when we explained the origin of this conflict, they didn't know what to say. But recently we were told, well, you think it was a coup, but we believe that it was a democratic processes. I believe it's a shame. It's truly shameful, but it's in such conditions that we are forced to negotiate. And this Ukraine that you want to see in NATO is currently represented by President Zelensky. Back in the day when Yatsenyuk was Prime Minister of Ukraine, spoke about people in the east of Ukraine, in Donbass, who were opposing their power, called the people in Donbass, he called them non-people. And Zelensky spoke about them and said, and used the word specimens. And he said, if you want to speak Russian, if you want to live in Russian culture, well, pack your things and go to Russia. Perhaps he should get rid of those people who don't want Ukraine to be involved in NATO, who understand what risks for Ukraine this joining NATO is fraught with. Well, in the current situation, we don't have a choice between whom to support. We should all reunite and be adults when we discuss how we can make sure that what the West said about their obligations not to strengthen anyone's security to the detriment of that of others is respected. There is a meme, not a word about Ukraine without Ukraine, and here at these press conferences we have a long-standing tradition to give the floor to Ukrainian journalists. I believe it's time to respect this tradition. Is it Mr. Tsimbaluk? No, this time I believe it's Anatoly Sharia. Good afternoon. I'm not Cymbaluk, new Новое издание, and I'm personally sanctioned by the president. We have a question. What did Moscow want when it started a dialogue on security guarantees? Because Russia could not fail to understand what the West would respond with. And you have already mentioned the responses that were voiced previously. Why did you need that? In Ukraine, there is a theory that Moscow intentionally requested something big in order to bargain for something less, maybe behind the scenes. What are the real arguments that Russia has in order for the collective West to change their position? Can it be Cuba or something else? We were not trying to play some games. We were not trying to follow this scenario that some in Ukraine have mentioned. I mean, ask for more and you'll be given less. That's a very well-known, a popular trick that is very commonly used in life, in politics, but we are much more serious than that. We categorically reject the fact that right there at our borders, NATO is going to appear. Especially given the policy that the Ukrainian leadership, both previous and the current ones, are conducting. For us, it's a veritable red line, and they know it all too well. Point number 2, even if Ukraine remains out of NATO, there might be bilateral agreements with Americans, with the British, with other countries who create military sites, bases in the Azov Sea. And it's unacceptable for us as well. Because when strike weapons are deployed in neighboring states, and these weapons are going to represent a threat for Russia, is another red line. And the EU, we have already mentioned the EU and Ukraine. The EU is currently very active in promoting their plans on sending a military training mission to Ukraine. They want to make their own contribution to training anti-Russian units. And by the way, there at the contact line, there is an increase in concentration of troops, including, as far as I can see, their most powerful units, the so-called volunteering battalions that the West used to consider as extremists, but does not do this any longer. And Ukraine is currently redeploying troops in its territory, including along the contact line. It has amassed an uncommonly high number of troops, but the West is not concerned with that. It is instead concerned with what Russia is doing in its territory. Let me remind you, however, that Russia has never, ever publicly or privately threatened the Ukrainian people anywhere, anytime. But speaking of Mr. Zelensky and his allies, they are doing this openly. I have already quoted Zelensky when he demanded that Russian speakers leave Ukraine. What happens if he decides to use those armed forces in order to expel Russians from there? Because Kiev is considering this plan B. Mr. Kuleba spoke to Croatians about their experience of the so-called storm operation when 200,000 Serbians found themselves outside their former motherland and became refugees. That is why I suggest that when our Western colleagues consider who moves their troops where in their own territory, let them consider the goals proclaimed by Ukrainian radicals, headed essentially by the president, regarding ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. We'll take another online question. Open TV Greece, are you here with us?
Да, добрый день.
Good afternoon.
У меня вопросы как-то тоже косвенно связаны с
My question
Украиной.
has to do with Ukraine.
Греция старается, кажется, не фанатично поддерживать общие
Greece is not all
решения,
that fanatic in supporting NATO's decision. However, it develops and restores its traditional relations with Russia. It's not easy for small countries such as Greece. And recently, we see the Kremlin and the Russian media mention new American bases in the city of Alexandroupolis in northern Greece, and its participation in the redeployment of military equipment in Ukraine. How critical is it for Russia? Has it been discussed? It's been 3 years since the world orthodoxy has been undergoing its perhaps first ever geopolitical schism, and the situation is exacerbating, this schism is deepening. Perhaps diplomacy could help churches so that our common traditions, common history, so that we search for compromise.
Вы сказали, что Греция не фанатично
you have said
поддерживает НАТО.
That Greece is not fanatic in
Мы с
supporting NATO.
греческими нашими коллегами, с греческим народом, с Грецией как страной
As for Greece,
имеем
the
очень
Greek
давние
people
отношения.
and Greece as a country,
Исторические
our
корни.
relations
Помним
with them are
Каподистри,
very
который стал первым правителем
historic. We
современной
remember
Греции
Capodistri, who became the
после
first
службы в
ruler
Российской
of
Федерации на
modern Greece
внешнеполитическом
after
фронте,
serving
кстати сказать.
in
совсем
Russia
недавно мы
in its
имели
foreign
хорошие
policy
переговоры
service.
с
Very
Никосом
recently, we had
Дендиасом.
great negotiations with
обсуждали
Nikos
всё.
Dendis,
И наши
and we have
двусторонние
covered
связи,
a full range of our issues,
развитие
including our bilateral relations,
торгово-экономических,
trade and
инвестиционных,
economic, investment
культурных,
cooperation,
гуманитарных
cultural,
отношений.
humanitarian
Они
ties.
очень действительно богатые, эти отношения на
And
всех
these
направлениях, в том
relations
числе
are very
и
rich in all
в сфере
dimensions,
безопасности.
including our security
Да, мы
cooperation.
затрагивали тему вот
We have
новых
touched
шагов,
upon
которые были
the
сделаны
topic of these
в
new
американо-греческих
developments
отношениях по
in American-Greek
повышению
relations
статуса
on
порта
increasing
Александрополис
the
для
status of the
целей военно-морских
Alexandroupolis
сил
port
Соединенных Штатов.
in order to
И да,
be
мы
able to
читали,
host
конечно,
American
в
Navy.
каких
And of course, we have
направлениях
read about
американцы
those
будут этот порт
dimensions and those objectives
Минских
that this port is going
есть
to be used.
прямой запрет
Minsk
на
agreements
нахождение
include
зарубежных
a direct
военнослужащих,
prohibition for the presence of
зарубежных
foreign
вооруженных людей на
servicemen
территории
in the
Украины.
territory of Ukraine.
Там нет запрета на поставки вооружений
It does
на
not contain
Украину.
any prohibition for
Но,
supplying
во-первых,
weapons to
военнослужащие
Ukraine.
зарубежные там есть, и
Point
много.
one, there are
Не там
foreign
в тысячах
servicemen,
измеряется,
and they are
как кто-то
numerous.
иногда
It's not
по ошибке
thousands,
говорит,
as
но там
someone has
несколько
once
сотен
said. It's about a few
американцев,
hundreds, a few
британцев
hundred
и
Americans,
прочих.
British and other
На
servicemen.
вооружение формально там запрета нет. Но,
Formally, there is no
возвращаясь к
ban
тому,
on providing weapons to
какие
Ukraine.
замыслы
However, getting
вынашивает
back
нынешняя
to
украинская
those
власть,
ideas that
конечно,
the
мы
current
прекрасно
Ukrainian
понимаем, что
authorities
всё,
are currently
что
developing,
делает Запад
we
в плане
understand all too
накачивания
well that everything the West
этой
is
власти
doing
оружием
when it provides weapons
создает у
to
нее
these authorities
дополнительное искушение перейти к
tempts
силовым методам
Ukraine to proceed
решения
to
вопросов
the force
на востоке
methods
Украины.
of resolving the
И
situation
нам
in the
это
east of Ukraine.
абсолютно неприемлемо по
And it
понятным
is
причинам.
completely unacceptable for us,
Кстати, вот
for
насчет
reasons you can
инструкторов,
understand.
как якобы
And speaking of
инструкторы там
those
работают,
alleged instructors
и
that are working there,
нам Запад, когда мы привлекаем к этому
and
внимание,
when we
всегда
draw
говорит, что ну, это же
the West's
инструкторы, они же не
attention
участвуют в боевых действиях.
to
Va bene,
Я
this
passiamo al
fact, the West
commento
says those are
perché
instructors, they
телевизионную картину
do
credo
not
che
participate
gli
in
argomenti siano
the
stati
fighting.
toccati
And
tutti.
I remember
Benissimo, è una lunga conferenza stampa, ci sono molte domande, ho preso un po' di appunti e credo che sia interessante molti spunti che sono stati toccati in questa intervista. Nella conferenza iniziale, nella presentazione iniziale dell'azione dell'azione diplomatica del Ministero degli Esteri, possiamo citare la preoccupazione per l'espansionismo della NATO, che spinge l'ingresso anche di paesi scandinavi. L'azione russa ha chiesto di fermare l'espansionismo NATO. I punti principali che ha detto: dialogo sulla sicurezza nucleare è stato affrontato, è stata ribadita la posizione di entrambi, anche con il presidente Biden, di un no alla guerra nucleare, il lavoro fatto per evitare i rischi di una guerra nucleare in caso di conflitto. Grande lavoro, ad esempio, per lo Stato Unito con la Bielorussia. Ha parlato dell'amicizia con i trattati, vi ricordate, ne abbiamo già discusso, il trattato di amicizia, di alleanza con l'India, che è stato firmato poco tempo fa. Con la Cina adesso stanno trattando per la firma di uno analogo con l'Iran, anche per la difesa. Ha citato il miglioramento di rapporti con molti paesi africani. Avrete seguito le vicende recenti della Repubblica Centrafricana, del Mali e di altri paesi che si sono rivolti alla Russia per combattere il terrorismo, visto i fallimenti sostanziali, ad esempio, delle politiche occidentali nel contrastare il terrorismo, nel preparare le forze armate locali, che sostanzialmente si trasformava in una presenza perenne delle forze francesi, senza arrivare poi a una soluzione del problema. Grande lavoro per risolvere le crisi in Medio Oriente. Ha citato le tensioni tra l'Azerbaigian e l'Armenia, parlando di guerra fratricida. Ha parlato della recente missione nel Kazakistan. Grande lavoro per il Medio Oriente. Sappiamo tutti della presenza siriana nella lotta russa in Siria per la lotta al terrorismo, e con i rapporti che sta intrattenendo con l'Iraq e tutti gli altri paesi in Medio Oriente. Nel 2022 continuerà l'azione politica russa su tutti questi fronti. Ha citato anche, tra l'altro, un grande lavoro per migliorare il multiculturalismo, il multireligione, il multietnicità che caratterizzano da sempre la Russia. È molto importante queste parole del presidente Lavrov. Per quanto riguarda le domande, da notare subito che non ha trattato direttamente i temi legati alla questione della mancata risposta. Ci hanno pensato poi le domande dei giornalisti a cercare di focalizzare su questo tema la questione. Ad esempio, nella prima domanda relativa ai contenuti presentati dalla Russia, alle domande poste dalla Russia alle controparti occidentali, il ministro Lavrov ha specificato che pensa che i suoi colleghi abbiano compreso gli argomenti che la Russia ha presentato. Una delle cose che ha detto e che credo siano molto importanti è che la pazienza con l'Occidente è giunta al termine. Abbiamo sopportato a lungo, ora è tempo di muoversi. Ha detto che loro non aspetteranno le risposte per sempre. Tenete presente che fino adesso non è arrivata una risposta scritta da parte degli Stati Uniti alle questioni poste dalla Russia. Il fatto che questa risposta non sia arrivata, perché loro hanno chiesto una risposta scritta, è importante, perché ufficialmente la Russia è ancora in attesa. Quando Ryabkov ha detto non credo che ci saranno ulteriori incontri, intende che le domande che la Russia ha posto, le questioni che la Russia ha posto sono state inviate per iscritto a loro, sono state spiegate negli incontri a tutti i livelli con gli Stati Uniti, con la NATO, con l'OSCE, che vi ricordo è l'organizzazione per la sicurezza in Europa e cooperazione, e quindi direi che si sia concluso l'iter delle spiegazioni. Ora è il tempo delle risposte, e se queste risposte non arrivano, la pazienza russa è finita, nel senso che non aspetteranno per sempre, intende che aspetteranno poco per trarre le conclusioni. Poi c'è stata tutta una serie di questioni, diversi hanno chiesto ad esempio quale sarà la risposta. C'è la questione del posizionare forze armate russe su basi in zone strategiche di influenza americana. Capite bene che tanti prospettano il posizionamento di basi militari, di missili, ad esempio a Cuba, a un passo dalle coste della Florida, come negli anni 60, o in Venezuela, base militare magari per prevenire un'invasione da parte della Colombia e del Brasile, che ricordiamo è retta ancora da quel pazzo di Bolsonaro. E per carità, la Colombia è un narco paese, servo in misura allucinante degli Stati Uniti, che reprime con violenza le manifestazioni della popolazione, nel silenzio di tutti, tra l'altro. Le risposte, gli Stati Uniti hanno già fatto presente che di fronte a questa opzione sarebbero assolutamente durissimi nel rispondere alla Russia se questa osasse mai comportarsi come si comportano loro nel mondo. E questo è anche molto, diciamo, ci spiega molto della loro mentalità. Lavrov su questo è stato abbastanza evasivo, non ha risposto direttamente. Marco Bordoni scrive che secondo lui una risposta in caso di mancata risposta americana o di rifiuto scritto delle proposte, delle questioni poste dalla Russia, la risposta della Russia dovrebbe essere asimmetrica, nel senso che tutti si aspettano l'invasione dell'Ucraina. Marco pensa invece che la risposta sarà eclatante, ma non quella che tutti si attendono. Quindi una proposta di grande impatto, ma non scontata. E in questo caso potrebbe essere in effetti un posizionamento improvviso e non annunciato di sistemi d'arma in paesi amici e vicini agli USA. Questo per rispondere in maniera del tutto simmetrica ai movimenti che gli americani fanno ai confini della Russia, e vedere come poi la prendano loro di essere sotto la minaccia delle armi, senza capacità di rispondere, vista l'estrema, il minimo preavviso che ci sarebbe in caso di missili ipersonici lanciati con basi da Cuba, ad esempio. Non la prenderebbero sicuramente bene. Altri argomenti sulle domande. Ecco, una delle cose che ha precisato Lavrov è stato che negli ultimi anni la presenza militare americana nei paesi ai confini con la Russia, come ad esempio la Polonia, per citarne una, o altri paesi come la Romania, le stesse esercitazioni che hanno iniziato a fare nell'ovest dell'Ucraina, con anche la presenza di soldati della NATO nella zona di Leopoli, sono aumentate in maniera significativa e preoccupano moltissimo la Russia, e come dargli torto. Questo atteggiamento oltretutto ha specificato che si vince anche dalla pressione che fanno sui paesi scandinavi per spingerli a entrare nella NATO. Artificiale, ha citato più volte, cioè questi paesi che sono da decenni indipendenti militarmente e politicamente, paesi scandinavi che non fanno parte della NATO come la Svezia o la Finlandia, che fa parte invece della UE, sono spinti fortemente quindi a entrare nella NATO, artificiosamente, ha detto, perché negli anni di crisi e di guerra fredda non ne facevano parte, come anche continua a non farne parte l'Austria, e quindi perché entrarne a far parte adesso? Gli Stati Uniti spingono per questo, per poter posizionare poi i loro sistemi d'arma molto più vicini agli obiettivi sensibili della Russia. Vi ricordo che quanto poco disti dal confine est della Finlandia, ad esempio il bastione a nord della Russia con le basi dei sottomarini e via dicendo. È possibile che la Russia accetti questo cambiamento che è evidentemente aggressivo della NATO? Ovvio che no. Così come gli Stati Uniti non hanno accettato a suo tempo il posizionamento dei missili a Cuba e hanno ritirato dall'Europa i loro Pershing, così come la Russia rinunciò a posizionare i missili a Cuba. Ecco, questi equilibri hanno garantito i 70 anni di pace, non di certo l'Unione Europea. Unione Europea che è stata anche citata nelle domande a un certo punto, perché una giornalista ha chiesto se l'Unione Europea, attraverso il signor Borrell, avesse avviato una procedura per avere dei contatti separati, indipendenti, con la Russia sulle questioni della pace in Europa. Lavrov risponde che ha avuto sì l'impressione che la UE sia stata lasciata indietro, che abbia mal digerito questo fatto sia dagli Stati Uniti che dalla NATO. In effetti era il grande assente dalle trattative di questi giorni, e c'è una spiegazione che Lavrov dà, che è molto logica e realistica, e cioè che gli Stati Uniti abbiano deliberatamente escluso, estromesso la figura burocratica però esistente della UE, non invitandola a nessun colloquio, non coinvolgendola in nessuna incontro. Tra l'altro si è sentito con alcuni leader, il presidente Biden, dei paesi europei, ma non con le autorità europee. Questo va bene ai paesi europei perché sono riconosciuti come le autentiche figure che incarnano il comando all'interno dell'Unione, Germania e Francia. Poi la Gran Bretagna non ne fa più parte, ma di sicuro non ha digerito bene Borrell il fatto, e lo ha detto in tutti i modi possibili, di essere stato escluso totalmente dalla presenza nelle trattative. Questo tentativo quindi di egemonia politica e militare statunitense in Europa si evidenzia in queste fasi. Lavrov probabilmente cerca quindi di inserirsi e di inserire questo malcontento dell'Unione Europea all'interno della discussione. È possibile quindi che possa avviare un qualche tipo di incontro a breve con Borrell. Il problema è il tempo, il fattore tempo è assolutamente prioritario. Da stamattina, avrete letto sul canale Telegram, sono in stato di massima allerta di prontezza al combattimento tutte le forze armate della regione orientale della Russia. Ho letto anche che qualche unità è stata mobilitata e trasferita a Occidente, non so bene come, ma starei un po' attento a questo tipo di informazioni, perché il fronte a est non può essere sguarnito più di tanto, proprio perché è estremamente a est, e quindi sarebbe difficilmente rinforzabile in caso di attacco su quel lato. Il fatto che lo stiano mettendo in stato di massima prontezza al combattimento significa che qualcosa è vicino e non sarà ad est, però vogliono che anche quella regione sia preparata a qualunque tipo di evenienza. Molti convogli nei giorni scorsi, a partire dall'11, sono in trasferimento verso ovest, questo sì, dalle regioni anche da est e dal centro. Le unità nel settore ovest della Russia stanno aumentando molto. Nel settore, diciamo, intorno al sud-ovest, le truppe schierate superano ormai le 100.000 unità. Alcune sono unità complete. Quello che ci preoccupa di più è il fatto che le temperature stiano scendendo, finalmente l'inverno è arrivato anche sul Mar Nero, e che il terreno stia gelando. Questo nel giro di pochi giorni, con temperature intorno a -8, -10, compatterà il terreno a sufficienza da permettere il passaggio dei carri. Questo nel caso serva. Molti carri armati sono stati visti ancora nei convogli, T-72 aggiornati, con unità 8 elettroniche sulla torretta, e lo schieramento è a punto ormai. Sono arrivati gli elicotteri, sono arrivati i cacciabombardieri di rinforzo. Non manca nulla se dovessero sferrare un colpo. Manca l'eventuale fattore, come alcuni ascoltatori mi hanno chiesto, cos'è che potrebbe scatenare la risposta. In effetti, quindi ringrazio, tra gli altri, c'è dei nomi dappertutto, ok, Michele De Angelis, Gianorel, Fulgenzio Cosa. No, ti ringrazio Moreno. Quanto può essere reale il conflitto oggi? I rischi sono alti. Anche l'Italia andrà in mezzo? No, perché non coinvolgerà le forze NATO. Quindi Moreno, stai tranquillo, non ci sarà questo tipo di coinvolgimento. Bartok, ma perché usate dei nomi strani? Ma avete paura a mettere il vostro? Mi chiede del casus belli. Il casus belli, a tutti gli effetti, non c'è neanche bisogno che ci sia un casus belli, perché c'è già stato. Avendo presentato come linee rosse la possibilità che la NATO si espanda nell'Ucraina, e avendo la NATO risposto che loro assolutamente non pongono limiti all'espansione, quindi se anche l'Ucraina ha diritto di aderire, la linea rossa di fatto è già stata superata. Aspettano la risposta scritta o un rifiuto formale alle loro questioni, oppure che scada un tempo che viene dato, che potrebbe essere il 20 di gennaio a questo punto, visti i movimenti in corso. Non c'è bisogno di un fattore, c'è bisogno di una decisione politica, e in questo caso quindi l'avremmo in tempi brevi. Mauro Cipelli, ti ringrazio anche per le domande e i complimenti, grazie anche a Matteo, grazie a Erpa, Barbagianni, Sì, Luciano Spada è finita come si sapeva che sarebbe finita. Max Connor, ripeto, Venezuela, Cuba, perché il Brasile? Il Brasile non è alleato della Russia, il Brasile è un paese che con la nomina del pazzo Bolsonaro a presidente, dopo aver truccato la corsa per le elezioni escludendo Lula con pretesti fasulli, come ha dimostrato poi la magistratura brasiliana, è un paese servo degli Stati Uniti a tutti gli effetti, quindi è da escludere. Per quanto riguarda Cuba e Venezuela abbiamo già trattato l'argomento. Paolo Cristiano, ti ringrazio per la domanda sulle dichiarazioni, spero che la risposta sia stata adeguata. Grazie a te Alberto Ghiazza, grazie per i complimenti. Sul Kazakistan Max Cherry mi chiede se la questione del Kazakistan si stia concludendo troppo velocemente. Io direi di no. Di no, nel senso che il CSTO ha dimostrato la sua prontezza al combattimento, la sua prontezza di impiego che è stata esemplare, assolutamente, e ora dimostra come questa velocità di impiego si risolva poi nel concludersi e quindi nel lasciare il paese che ha richiesto l'aiuto in tempi altrettanto veloci. La questione quindi se mi stai chiedendo se non ci sia un motivo per cui dura così poco, ti posso dire che la situazione si è stabilizzata in brevissimo tempo e quindi non ci sono più le ragioni per cui permangano le forze del CSTO all'interno del Kazakistan. È anche un costo oltretutto. Se ci siano delle ragioni politiche perché vengano fatte rientrare, posso dirti che non mi pare di vederne. Permangono alcune perplessità su alcuni atteggiamenti e nomine del governo, del nuovo governo kazako, ma come nostra abitudine giudichiamo sui fatti e non sul passato di alcune persone, quindi giudicheremo i provvedimenti del governo volta per volta per capire se c'è una svolta nel collocamento geopolitico del Kazakistan o se proseguirà nel solco trivalente di Nazarbayev, che ha cercato di tenere sempre i piedi in tante scarpe. Cina e Russia hanno fatto capire che le decisioni di schieramenti in Asia debbano essere più chiari e che quindi anche loro debbano prendere una linea meno ambigua, però è anche negli interessi del Kazakistan tenerle. Restano le preoccupazioni per le presenze ad esempio di un laboratorio chimico di livello 3 mi pare, che gli Stati Uniti avevano impiantato ai tempi di Nazarbayev, che adesso ormai è stato estromesso, e che quindi va risolta e chiarita. Non si sa che cosa ci fosse all'interno di questo laboratorio perché il governo, il presidente Nazarbayev non ha permesso alle forze del CSTO di controllare il loro contenuto per ragioni di sicurezza nazionale. Vediamo però se poi permarrà nel tempo, se verrà anche questo smantellato e chiuso. Quindi Max Cherry giudico molto negativamente l'inserimento di Umarov nel governo, però anche resta da chiarire qual è il suo ruolo e quali saranno i provvedimenti che vorrà prendere. Benissimo. Permangono quindi alcuni interrogativi anche dopo la conferenza stampa di Biden. Arriviamo alle conclusioni. Questa conferenza stampa ha fatto il punto un po' sull'opera annuale e pone ancora delle questioni. Intanto la borsa di Mosca sta scendendo perché non gradisce i segnali che arrivano dal mondo, come dice anche Marco Bordoni. gli echi di sciabola che vengono dal mondo della politica. Va bene, abbiamo la carica degli ussari e vediamo un po'. I dragoni tornano a farci visita sui campi di battaglia. La questione che sulla quale Lavrov ha voluto porre l'accento è senz'altro la questione temporale. Ha sollecitato, il messaggio più forte che è arrivato è, oltre alla risolutezza della Russia, la necessità di una risposta in tempi rapidi, una risposta chiara. Ha posto molto l'accento sul discorso degli accordi legali da sottoscrivere tra i vari paesi. Questo è una questione fondamentale per la Russia, non si fidano delle parole di nessuno e vogliono delle basi scritte legali che diano modo anche di giustificare le eventuali risposte in caso di violazione, e questo è molto, molto importante anche nella forma. E probabilmente anche per questo che Marco Bordoni, ad esempio, non crede molto nella soluzione militare della vicenda. Io tendo a dare anche fiducia a Marco, perché già in passato con questo suo atteggiamento mentale più pacato ha scelto la via giusta, che poi è stata scelta. Lui conosce meglio di me anche il mondo russo e pertanto gli do il giusto ascolto e considerazione. Io invece però guardo un attimo alle truppe che sono schierate, nel senso che tra la diplomazia delle parole e delle buone intenzioni mi resta sempre la deformazione mentale di contare cannoni, ecco. E quindi al momento dico che se vedo tanto fumo penso che ci sia anche un incendio da qualche parte. Il fumo in questo caso sono gli spostamenti delle forze armate e l'incendio che sto andando a cercare seguendo le tracce del fumo è probabilmente il rischio di un conflitto armato che ho paura di trovare a un certo punto e che divampi in maniera incontrollata. Benissimo, è stata una lunga puntata, molto silenziosa da parte mia, perché ero concentrato ad ascoltare la conferenza stampa che era in lingua inglese e spero che poi i commenti e i chiarimenti siano stati utili anche a voi. Ho notato alcune cose comunque, che il giornalista della ABC ha subito cercato di porre la questione degli posizionamenti delle armi, come anche la prima giornalista l'aveva posta. C'è stato anche un intervento di un giornalista della US Radio finlandese che neanche sapevamo esistesse, poi giornalisti ucraini tra l'altro e anche un giornalista greco. Poi ho interrotto un attimo perché veniva troppo lungo, ma non c'era un giornalista italiano. Notare sempre che la nostra presenza nella stampa estera non fa molto onore al nostro passato e l'Italia ha una posizione di politica estera sempre più supina e diciamo in posizione geometrica, no? Legata al triangolo retto e questo ci va, essendo sovrapponibili alle posizioni politiche degli Stati Uniti, ci rende inutili fondamentalmente, perché basta trattare con gli Stati Uniti, sai anche qual è la posizione dell'Italia, non ne ha una e quindi ciao. Gli accordi del Quirinale siglati a Roma non sono nient'altro che un accordo non paritario, ma che va a rendere china la politica italiana anche nei confronti dei cugini d'Oltralpe. Io spero sempre di sbagliarmi, ma su queste cose raramente succede. Vi ringrazio quindi per l'attenzione, vi rimando alla prossima puntata. Entro brevissimo tempo avremo un incontro con Virgilio per la rubrica I mastini della guerra. Con lui commenteremo con più attenzione, anche perché ci rivedremo bene i passi di questi giorni. Ieri c'è stato ad esempio l'incontro con l'OSCE che si è concluso esattamente come gli altri, sono state presentate le varie posizioni e il difetto di udito degli esponenti dei paesi europei ha continuato a manifestarsi. Ecco, gli consiglierei velocemente una visita ai centri Amplifon, che non è lo sponsor della trasmissione, e quindi di farsi controllare l'udito, perché a forza di non sentire gli avvisi attento che vai a sbattere, se non ci senti alla fine scopri che sbatti davvero la testa contro e scopri anche di aver avuto un problema all'udito oltre che al comprendonio. Vi ringrazio quindi per l'attenzione, grazie ancora a tutti gli ascoltatori e commentatori nel canale, vi ringrazio doppiamente se condividete sulle vostre pagine social i video, invitando i vostri amici a esaminarlo e commentare. Iscrivetevi al canale, grazie sempre a coloro che sostengono il canale, doppiamente grazie a coloro che lo fanno, e un caffè non ci guasta, ci sono le indicazioni sotto. Grazie ancora a tutti. Vi ringrazio e buona giornata.